This is the Bill Kelly Show on 900 CHML in Hamilton, 980 CFPL in London. I'm Shiona2 filling in for Bill for today. The provincial election in Ontario hasn't officially been called yet, but it has been underway for some time now. Promises and platform announcements just about every day. In fact, I think there's one going on right now from the Liberals just as we're speaking. A new Ipsos poll done exclusively for Global News shows that if an election were held today, the PCs would get about 35% of the vote, the Liberals 32%, and the NDP would probably get around 23%. Sean Simpson is the vice president of Ipsos and explains what he thinks the results are saying.
It really means that the election is still up for grabs. And I think a lot of that has to do with the relatively unknown leader in Stephen Del Duca. Some voters may be looking for an alternative to the Ford government, but they don't quite see it. They don't quite know who that is. They know Andrea Horwath, but, they may not want to vote NDP.
And he also has a few thoughts about what's notable in this poll.
What's notable about this poll is the amount of movement that we've seen in popular vote since just last month. The Tories are down, the Liberals are up, the NDP are flat, but what was a double-digit lead for the incumbent Tory government is now quite a slim 3-point lead for the Progressive Conservatives.
John Best is the founder of the publication The Bay Observer. He follows politics very closely, probably with a big bowl of popcorn, and he joins us right now. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Shiona. I can't eat popcorn anymore, but the rest of it is true.
Well, as I mentioned, the provincial election race is tightening. The Liberals gaining ground on the PCs in the poll that was commissioned by Global News, done by Ipsos. Is there a danger of political burnout by the time June 2nd rolls around?
I don't think so, because this is a really big election in the sense that it's going to be the first, I don't want to call it post-pandemic election, but certainly getting towards hopefully the end of it. The poll you just cited is very similar to the Abacus poll. It had the PCs at 36, the Liberals at 32, and the NDP at 23. The interesting thing about the Abacus poll was that Ford, even though the numbers on the voting intentions didn't favor him, he was far out in front in terms of how voters viewed him personally. 41% liked him, 31% for Andrea, in her case, against a 30% negative. So really a 1-point positivity. And then Del Duca had actually a negative rating of 22% like him, 27% not. So it's interesting. I can't recall seeing polls where the voter intention and the favorability of the leaders was so diverse.
That is a very interesting situation here, and I think it's something that people have been saying about Stephen Del Duca for some time. People just don't know him.
No, they don't, and to be honest, he's really going to have to up his game. I think he was in town earlier this week at a rally, and he really to say that he is not charismatic would probably be an understatement. He really does have a very, very I don't want to say robotic, but he really just doesn't have a lot of energy in the way he addresses voters now. And at the end of the day, these elections increasingly are based on, frankly, television and media, and more about their ads than anything else. So it's going to be interesting. Number one, even though they're coming back in the polling, how much money do the Liberals have? Locally, they think they're a factor in 3 of the ridings here, which is quite a change. I mean, we know obviously Hamilton East Stony Creek is wide open now with Paul Miller running as an independent, but they think they have a shot in the Ancaster Dundas Hamilton West riding as well, and I'm not sure where else, but it's I think at the end of the day, this campaign is really going to be important because people are going to get a really good look at these leaders, as particularly Del Duca.
Well, and so much of this, as you were mentioning, is the media and social media game, and who can play best to those platforms, because what might work in one area, one medium, may not work as well on the other. So you need some pretty good teams that are pushing your message and your personalities out there.
Yeah, I think the other thing with this most recent poll is for the last couple of weeks, Del Duca has really been out there. He's been in the news almost every day. He's made a number of promises, the handgun ban and some other things, whereas Ford has been relatively quiet. And I think the reason for that is that there is a budget coming out next week, and I think they're kind of marshaling all their resources for the budget. And that certainly will be, we just know without even seeing any of the budget that it's going to be filled with all sorts of promises. So I think that's part of it, may have some influence on where these polls are, is just the relative quietness of Ford and his people for the last 2 or 3 weeks.
Well, yeah, I mean, we've got so many tastes of what might be in the budget because we've had so many pre-budget announcement, pre-election promises. I think the tally so far is about $10 billion and counting.
Yes, interesting. Now, I don't know whether that has been factored into another story that came out in the last couple of weeks, suggesting that Ontario is on track to balance the budget in the next 2 or 3 years. Very surprising when you look at some of these promises that have been made. So I'm not sure whether the budget balancing prediction was made before these promises were announced or not, but I think most people were surprised to think that Ontario would balance its budget that quickly, especially since the federal budget doesn't look like it's going to get balanced until the end of the decade.
Well, I think that would depend on how closely people start looking at the balance sheet that is put forward on some of that. I mean, a balanced budget that quickly when we're experiencing the kinds of financial pressures that we are right now, not just in Ontario, but really around the world.
Yeah, it's a very uncertain time. We're facing terrible inflation right now. We're record inflation. Haven't seen anything like this in decades, and it's a bit of an uncertain time for any government. But I think at the provincial level, there's an understanding that a provincial government is not typically responsible for the national economy. So I'm not sure how much of a play that's going to get in this campaign.
Yeah. The Liberals, as you mentioned, have proposed more action on things like anti-racism, including more diversity in police hiring, and this whole handgun ban thing. Are those issues that are really going to capture people right now?
Well, the Liberals are trying to get back the seats that they lost in Toronto to the NDP. I mean, they were wiped out virtually in Toronto, which has always been a Liberal stronghold. So a handgun ban definitely probably resonates in Toronto, and that's where I think that promise is largely aimed. Banning handguns is fine, but I think essentially all it does is leave the illegal handguns still in the hands of the criminals. But still, I think in Toronto, where they've had so many shootings, there's shootings every weekend. A lot of violent crime there. That's where that promise is aimed, and we'll just have to see whether people take it seriously or not. The diversity on police forces is certainly a good move, but it's not clear to me how a provincial government necessarily mandates that, since the police services have local governance, but certainly more diversity on police forces is a good notion, and it's not going to offend anybody, I don't think.
Well, just getting back to the proposed handgun ban, that was one of the platform announcements from Del Duca this week. We've had those promises before. We've had the usual pushback of, all you're doing is banning legal guns as opposed to those that come into the province illegally. We've heard all of this before, and there's never really been any action.
No, it's and I think on on this program earlier this week, they were interviewing a journalist from the National Post who essentially said, of all the announcements you could make, why would you make that announcement? And my sense of it is it's not going to resonate province-wide, but if you're being strategic, I think it would have some resonance in Toronto, and I'm guessing that's why he made the announcement.
Well, and the Liberals have always done fairly well in metropolitan areas.
They have, and certainly if the Del Duca is looking at where he is in the polls, where he's not neck and neck, but very close to Ford, the obvious place for them to win is where they, in some cases, fairly narrowly lost in the last election. I don't think anybody ever believed that the Ontario Liberal Party was a 7-seat party. That's not sort of the natural course of things. So back to these polls, what you're really seeing is a little bit of a rebalancing of normalcy in some sense, that the Liberals are regaining some of their strength. I guess for Ford, his biggest issue is hoping that Andrea comes up a little bit, because the gap between the Liberals and her would suggest a minority government if the election was held today.
Mm-hmm. But at least a government.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, except we saw what happened in Ottawa, and I'm not sure that the Liberals and the NDP would, if they, between the two of them, have the most seats. I think there'd be tremendous pressure for them to vote the Conservatives out and form some kind of an alliance.
If we could just cycle back to the Ipsos poll that was commissioned by Global News, and just as a reminder, we're speaking with John Best, the founder of the Bay Observer, and in that poll we heard that it was basically 35% support for the Ford Tories, 32% support for the Del Duca Liberals, 23% for the Horwath NDP, and I think the Green Party is around 5%. I think a lot of people really like Mike Schreiner, who's the leader of the Green Party, but they're not willing to put their vote there just yet. I was surprised as to how close that was at this point going into the election.
Well, yes, I think what we're seeing are people are kind of parking their votes and their opinions right now. I mean, that'd be quite an accomplishment if Del Duca, if the actual election were held and he ended up with 32% of the vote. That's a tremendous accomplishment, given where they're coming from. But we still got a campaign, and of the three, certainly Ford. The interesting thing about Ford is that his approval ratings were at 28% last year. Now, mind you, that was in a very bad year in terms of pandemic and a whole bunch of other things. But he's up to 41% now, and his likability factor. I mean, there's a large group of people that hate him, but I think he comes across, I think, as a warmer person than either of the other two leaders, and so I think the campaign's really going to be important.
Do you think, there are some people who feel that the dropping of mask mandates and not doing as much testing is all trying to put onto a back burner some of the more contentious issues with regards to the Ford government's response to COVID. Do you think that is having an impact, if that's working?
Well, I think he took a bit of a gamble that by lifting the mandates, and then almost immediately we started seeing the COVID numbers going up. Luckily, with less severity, because the intensive care numbers are not rising the way the hospitalization numbers and the case counts. It's a bit of a gamble. He's looking ahead to the election date in June. That gives us the rest of April and hopefully a warm month of May, where that'll tend to dampen down the cases. But if there had been a tremendous outbreak of COVID as a result of those mask mandates, he was vulnerable on that issue. So I think it was a bit of a gamble, and we still don't know how it's going to end up. Although some of the science table data seems to suggest that maybe things are tapering off, and if that's the case, then maybe the picture looks quite a bit better on June 2nd. But a bit of a gamble, I would say, to remove the mandates and risk another serious outbreak right around election time.
There was something that happened in the last couple of days that I wanted to get your opinion on, and that was kind of airing a bit of dirty linen, if you will. Toby Barrett from Haldeman, Norfolk, who is not going to be running for re-election for the Tories, had a few comments about the person who is going to be running under that banner in that riding, and that's Ken Hewitt, and they were at odds about a few things, and I was kind of surprised to see that he was commenting.
I thought that was not well handled. I'm assuming that Barrett did step down voluntarily, that he wasn't pushed out, and certainly he could have expected after the number of years he served that riding that he'd be able to make his own announcement, and then there'd be an orderly, selection of Hewitt. So I think that was a bit of a stumble, really, and. I think Hewitt jumped offline a little quickly, and I have some sympathy for Barrett for, he's been one of the longest serving members of that caucus that, that just common courtesy would dictate that he gets a chance to make his own announcement. So I don't blame him for being a bit peeved. I don't think it'll change the outcome in that riding. That riding is so conservative and has been for a long, long time. So I don't expect it's going to change the outcome of who ends up. I think Mr. Hewitt is in probably pretty good shape in the coming election.
No, I agree with you. That's not really one of the ridings that I'm going to be keeping an eye on. No. In this area, for me, Hamilton East Stony Creek. That at least looks kind of interesting.
It really does. With Jason Farr jumping in for the Liberals, you've got somebody with a lot of name recognition, a lot of experience. I watched his nomination event, and Jason, having worked in radio for the number of years that he did, there was no dead air. He really expressed himself very well, and he's going to be good at the door. And so he's a formidable candidate. There's no question about it. It was interesting that not only did Paul Miller show up and watch the event from the parking lot, but Neil Lumsden apparently was in the background watching the event as well. So it's obvious that Farr's candidacy is being taken seriously. But with Miller running his own campaign, it's not great news for the NDP. The question is who benefits. Do people see the NDP and the Liberals sort of drawing from the same voter pool, in which case it's not a conservative riding, but Neil Lumsden is pretty well known. It's going to be fun to watch that race for sure. One of the most interesting races in Ontario, I would think.
Well, and Farr and Lumsden know each other. If I'm not mistaken, Jason Farr at one point, and it might have been during the Neil Lumsden era, was an announcer for the Hamilton Tiger Cats. So, politics does make strange bedfellows sometimes.
Yeah, it does. And in the same thing, the NDP nominee, whose father is the NDP Riding Association president, was a very close friend of Paul Miller. And and defended Paul Miller when there were a number of controversies, and suddenly it's his son that's now running, and apparently the friendship has come to an end.
Well, and Miller still has a lot of support within the Steelworkers Local 1005.
Yeah, I don't think this is going to be a typical one where the incumbent runs as an independent and gets clobbered. It's going to be tough to see him win that seat with the division, but he's not going to, he's going to get some votes, and he's going to have a following because he won that riding 4 times by very, very comfortable margins. So there's a lot of Paul Miller fans out there that don't quite understand. It was never clearly fully stated exactly why he's out of the party. It's not like it was a personal scandal of some kind. It's something about a website, or is he not retweeting something that has a racial connotation. So there's no clarity as to why he was booted, other than we know that he and Andrea Horvath hated each other and had for years. But beyond that, there's no real public stain on the guy. And so I think he's going to be a factor.
John, it's always interesting to hear your views on politics and provincial politics. There's a reason why they call it the Bay Observer, because you observe these things very, very closely. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure, Shiona.